The morning sun cut sharp over the rows of flags hanging limp at Arlington, their colors dulled against the pale sky. At the gate, an old man in a frayed suit stood silently, a scratched Rolex glinting faintly on his wrist. "Is this some kind of joke?" the guard barked, blocking his way. A ripple of laughter followed from nearby soldiers, but the man didn't flinch. He spoke softly, voice steady as stone. "I came to honor a friend." The words hung in the air, unsettling, impossible to mock. The guards reached for his arm. Then time itself seemed to freeze, the tick of his battered watch marking the moment before everything would change. The guard's hands hovered near his elbow, the crowd shifting uneasily at the spectacle of an old man who looked out of place among pressed uniforms and gleaming medals. Ethan Brooks did not resist. Instead, his eyes drifted past the steel gate toward the rows of white headstones and the slow, solemn movement of a flag-draped casket in the distance. For a moment, the noise of Arlington dulled, replaced by a heavier silence that seemed to pull him backward through time. The sunlit grass dissolved into a memory soaked in rain and fire. It was 1968, the jungles of Vietnam, and the air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through cloth. A young Ethan crouched low in the mud, rifle clutched tight, the green of his fatigues already blackened with grime. The stench of gunpowder mingled with rotting vegetation, and above it all, the pounding rhythm of rotor blades faded away as the evacuation chopper disappeared into mist. The squad was stranded, outnumbered, and every sound in the canopy screamed danger. Beside him, Private Wallace gasped for air, a bullet wound blooming dark across his chest. Ethan remembered staring at the second hand of his Rolex, cracked during a fall, yet still moving with steady defiance. He used it as a lifeline. "Hold on," he whispered, gripping Wallace's wrist. "We move on my count." Every tick became a heartbeat, every minute a promise that he would not let the young soldier slip away. The jungle shimmered and then vanished. Arlington's manicured lawns came back into focus, though Ethan still felt the phantom weight of Wallace across his shoulders. He shifted slightly, his bones creaking, but his jaw remained firm. The guards saw a frail trespasser. Ethan carried the image of a life saved through grit, timing, and an unshakable sense of duty. "Sir, this area is restricted," one of the soldiers barked, but his voice trembled almost imperceptibly. Ethan's gaze stayed distant, and the silence around him gained a gravity of its own. He could hear the laughter from decades past, Wallace telling crude jokes in the barracks, mocking the bitter instant coffee they shared before dawn patrols, swearing he'd never get married because the army was already his jealous mistress. Ethan could hear it as clearly as the ceremonial drums now echoing across Arlington, those echoes braided together, past and present, until Ethan felt time collapse into a single point. The Rolex ticked on his wrist. The crowd didn't notice, but he did. Each movement of that scratched second hand reminded him of crawling through the jungle under fire, dragging Wallace inch by inch, counting breaths, counting seconds, telling himself that discipline was stronger than fear. That mindset had carried him across decades, long after medals had tarnished and fellow soldiers had gone. Respect, he had learned, was never pinned to a uniform. It lived in choices no one saw. The younger lieutenant supervising the guards watched Ethan with open suspicion. He saw only an old man in a worn suit, a relic who seemed confused or delusional. But Ethan's silence unsettled him. It was not the silence of weakness, but of authority, like a commander who no longer needed to raise his voice. The lieutenant shifted uneasily but stood his ground. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave immediately," he said, louder this time so the surrounding crowd could hear. A murmur spread among the onlookers. Some shook their heads, assuming this was another veteran wandering where he did not belong. A few smirked, others looked away, embarrassed. But Ethan's stillness drew a different kind of attention, subtle and disquieting. He seemed to stand taller with every second, though his shoulders were bent by age. Flashbacks bled into his vision, the jungle again, the rain drumming on leaves, the roar of machine guns in the distance. Ethan saw himself carrying Wallace on his back, the Rolex pressed against his palm as he timed bursts between enemy fire. He remembered whispering numbers, willing his legs to keep moving, discipline outweighing the pain of shrapnel in his thigh. He remembered stumbling into the clearing, the impossible relief of seeing the rescue bird descend, the rush of wind as the blades scattered the canopy. Wallace's blood had soaked through his shirt, but his heart still beat, steady and stubborn, like the watch Ethan clutched. He had promised Wallace then. If they made it out alive, he would wear that watch until the end, not as a trophy, but as a covenant. Wallace had smiled weakly through bloodied lips, rasping, "Time will prove who you are." The words branded Ethan's soul. Now, half a century later, those words returned like a command. Ethan raised his chin, meeting the lieutenant's gaze for the first time. His voice, when it came, was soft but carried the clarity of a bell. "General Wallace would want me here." The sentence sliced through the noise of the crowd. Some laughed nervously, others muttered about senility. The guards tightened their grip, prepared to escort him out, but the lieutenant hesitated. The name landed with more weight than expected. General Wallace was no ordinary figure. His legacy was carved into the very foundation of the army. Why would this frail man invoke him with such certainty? The crowd leaned closer, curious now. Ethan didn't elaborate. He let the silence hang, just as he had once let silence hold steady during ambushes, waiting for the enemy to reveal themselves. His eyes flicked to the casket slowly making its way toward the front, carried by soldiers who moved in perfect formation. He exhaled, and for a fleeting second, the years fell away. He was no longer a relic, he was a wit.
Someone asked. "Maybe he served with Wallace," another suggested. Skepticism mingled with doubt, and for the first time the ridicule began to waver. Ethan stood perfectly still, the Rolex glinting under the sun. He did not argue, did not plead. He simply waited, embodying the lesson that had carried him through war. Patience was the sharpest weapon. Every tick of the watch seemed to amplify the question now rising in the crowd's minds. What if this stranger was more than he appeared? What if respect was not a matter of rank, but of the unseen sacrifices that had built the very stage on which today's ceremony stood? In that liminal space between mockery and revelation, Ethan Brooks held his ground. The drums rolled louder, the casket drew nearer, and the air itself seemed to suspend judgment. The opening act of a forgotten story was unfolding, and no one yet knew how explosive the truth would be. The murmurs in the crowd swelled like waves breaking against stone. The guards tightened their grip on Ethan's arms, prepared to move him away from the sacred ground, but his gaze never wavered from the flag-draped casket approaching in measured cadence. The lieutenant in charge gave a curt nod, and the soldiers moved to escort him back toward the gate. Their boots struck the pavement in unison, echoing louder than the ceremonial drums for Ethan, each step threatening to erase decades of memory, sacrifice, and the promise he had carried. His body bent forward slightly, not from weakness, but from a stubborn desire to resist without force. He let them take him a few feet before his voice cut through the air with unexpected clarity. "General Wallace would want me to stay." The words did not roar, yet they landed with surprising weight. Some spectators glanced at one another, eyebrows raised. Who was this man who spoke as though he knew the general personally? The lieutenant's jaw hardened, but doubt flickered in his eyes. It was a dangerous moment, one where authority might crack beneath the burden of history. Still, his duty was clear. He gestured sharply, and the guards began fastening cold metal cuffs around Ethan's wrists. The sound of the snap was cruel against the backdrop of solemn silence. Gasps rose from the crowd. To some, it was the image of justice, an intruder removed. To others, it was troubling, as though tradition itself was being violated.
Ethan did not struggle. He lowered his head, his white hair falling across his weathered forehead. But inside, his mind was alive with memories of other shackles, invisible ones, imposed by war and silence. He remembered the long flight back from Vietnam, the way the young wounded men had lain strapped to stretchers, wrists bound not by law, but by the sheer force of injury. He remembered Wallace then too, strapped down but alive, whispering through the haze of morphine that survival meant everything. Now, in the present, those handcuffs felt like a cruel mockery of that night, as though the promise of brotherhood was being dismissed by the very institution that once depended on it. The lieutenant cleared his throat and raised his voice for the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. This individual has no authorization to be here." His words were smooth, but there was tension under them, a hint that he was uncertain. A young officer nearby, Lieutenant Hayes, shifted uncomfortably. He was new, his uniform crisp, his face unlined by experience. He watched Ethan closely, and something in the old man's silence unnerved him. Hayes had studied Wallace in academy history lectures. Wallace was not just a general, he was a legend. If this old man truly knew him, if he had been there when Wallace's reputation was forged, then perhaps history was being mishandled right in front of them. The casket drew closer, carried by solemn soldiers in white gloves. Ethan's eyes followed it, and he felt the tears threaten, but did not let them fall. Instead, he spoke again, softly, almost to himself, yet the words reached those nearest. "I was with him when the rain turned to fire. I carried him through the jungle when the sky abandoned us. I am no stranger here." His voice cracked but carried dignity, and suddenly the silence in the crowd deepened. A few older veterans stiffened, recognizing the cadence of memory. They had heard such tones before, the quiet authority of men who had lived through things textbooks could not capture. Yet the lieutenant pressed forward, determined to assert control. He motioned for the guards to move Ethan fully away from the gate, and the cuffs bit tighter against his skin. Ethan stumbled slightly, his knees weakened by age, but he righted himself with an effort that drew sympathetic glances from some spectators. The image was almost unbearable. A man old enough to be a grandfather, restrained as though he were a criminal, while the coffin of a general, his brother in arms, was carried past without him. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward, his voice low, hesitant. "Sir, perhaps we should verify his claim, if he truly knew General Wallace." The senior officer cut him off sharply. "Enough, Hayes. This man is a distraction. We have protocol." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Hayes could not look away from Ethan, from the watch that glinted faintly on his wrist, from the strange aura of authority that clung to him, despite his ragged suit. The crowd grew restless. A woman whispered to her husband, "What if he really was there?" Another murmured, "He sounds like one of them. You can't fake that." The soldiers carrying the casket did not break stride, but some of them flicked their eyes toward the commotion at the gate. One pair of young privates exchanged a look of discomfort. They had been raised in reverence for Wallace's legend. The idea that the man who had saved him was being dragged away like an intruder unsettled them in ways they could not voice. Ethan's memories bled further. He saw Wallace not in death but in life, roaring with laughter as they huddled under ponchos, swapping stories of home. He saw him on the ground, pale with blood loss, whispering about the future he thought he would never see. He remembered the feeling of Wallace's arm across his shoulder, the weight of another man's life pressing down as he staggered toward salvation. Each image slammed against his mind now as the cuffs dug deeper. He whispered Wallace's words again, though this time only Hayes caught them. "Time will prove who you are." Hayes shivered. It was too specific, too intimate to be random. He knew then that something about the old man's presence was not only authentic but essential.
Yet he was too junior to override his superior.
When the senior officer announced loudly for the benefit of the cameras nearby, "This gentleman is delusional. He is disrupting a ceremony of honor." The words hit Ethan like blows, not because of their content, but because they erased decades of truth. For the first time, he lowered his head fully, the weight of disbelief heavier than the cuffs. The laughter of a few onlookers stung more than shrapnel had ever done. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire legacy of sacrifice was vanishing into ridicule. Yet Ethan did not beg. He did not defend himself with volume. Instead, he let the stillness of his posture carry what his words could not. The Rolex ticked faintly, an anchor against despair. Hayes caught the rhythm, almost as though he could hear it across the silence. The lieutenant shifted again, caught between duty and doubt. As the guards turned him toward the waiting military vehicle, Ethan's eyes lifted once more toward the casket. He mouthed words no one heard clearly, but Hayes read his lips. "Welcome home." The gesture struck Hayes like lightning, searing him with the certainty that the man in cuffs was no imposter. But the order stood, and the vehicle door yawned open, ready to swallow the old man's dignity. The crowd began to divide. Some muttered that it was right, that order had to be preserved. Others whispered that perhaps history was being denied a witness. The tension swelled, pressing against the ceremony itself. The drums rolled on. The honor guard carried out their duty. But in the shadow of the gate, a battle was being fought not with weapons, but with truth and silence. Ethan stood with his wrists bound, his back straight despite the weight. He knew humiliation well. It had walked beside him for decades as he lived quietly, without medals or speeches. Yet he also knew patience. Time had carried him this far. Time, he believed, would reveal everything. The American dream was not in riches or recognition. It was in discipline, in standing firm when the world laughed, in waiting for the moment when silence became the loudest voice in the room. The senior officer barked for the vehicle to move. The crowd gasped again. Hayes clenched his fists, fighting the urge to speak. Ethan closed his eyes. The memory of Wallace's promise filled him with strength one more time. And as the vehicle door shut with a metallic thud, the scene burned itself into the minds of all who watched. Something unspoken had shifted, a tension rising like a storm that no one could yet name. Would the truth surface? Would time finally prove who this man was? The question lingered in every heart as the casket reached its resting place, and the sound of the Rolex ticking beneath the handcuffs became the rhythm of a story that was far from finished. The vehicle door slammed shut, and for a few breathless moments, the sound seemed louder than the drums of the funeral procession. Inside, Ethan sat, with his wrist chained, the leather of the seat stiff against his back. He lowered his head, feeling the cuffs cut into his thin skin, but his mind refused to surrender. He thought of Wallace's last words to him on that drenched battlefield, how he had pressed the watch into Ethan's palm and whispered that time would prove who he was. That memory had carried Ethan through decades of obscurity, and it returned now with painful clarity as the hum of the vehicle engine idled. Outside, the ceremony continued, but inside, silence pressed like a storm waiting to break. The lieutenant in charge stood just beyond the door, giving crisp orders to maintain order and move the vehicle to a holding area. Lieutenant Hayes lingered nearby, his brows drawn tight, unease flashing across his young face. He replayed the old man's words, the strange weight behind them, and the flicker of recognition he had seen when Ethan looked at the casket. Doubt gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He leaned toward the senior officer. "Sir, I really think we should confirm his identity before we proceed further." The officer glared at him, dismissive. "Hayes, we are running a state funeral for a 4-star general. The last thing we need is to entertain the ramblings of a confused old man. Stand down." But Hayes could not shake the feeling. He stepped back, but his eyes never left Ethan, and then, as if destiny itself had decided the moment had ripened, a convoy of black vehicles rolled into the cemetery, their windows tinted, flags fluttering from polished hoods. The arrival pulled every gaze in its direction. From the lead car stepped General Peters, the Army Chief of Staff, his uniform immaculate, his demeanor commanding. His presence shifted the atmosphere instantly, silencing chatter and freezing motion. The senior officer stiffened, suddenly nervous. General Peters walked with measured steps, his face carved with the gravity of decades of command. His eyes swept across the crowd, across the casket, and finally across the scene at the gate, where a frail old man sat cuffed in a military vehicle. Peters's stride faltered. He looked again, longer this time, and something flickered across his face, recognition. The senior officer quickly snapped to attention, saluting. "General, sir, the situation is under control. A civilian attempted to disrupt the ceremony." Peters cut him off with a curt motion of his hand. "Open the door." His voice carried the tone of authority that admitted no argument. The guards hesitated, uncertain. Peters's eyes sharpened. "Now!" The locks clicked and the door swung open. Ethan lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting the general's. For a moment, the entire cemetery seemed to pause. Peters's jaw tightened, his features stiff with a struggle to maintain composure. Then he stepped closer, his own voice dropping to something both personal and reverent. "Shepherd." The word cracked like lightning, a code name known only to a few, a call sign that had once traveled through static-filled radios in jungles and deserts. Gasps rippled through the soldiers nearby. Ethan did not speak. He simply raised his cuffed wrists slightly, the Rolex catching the sunlight, and lowered them again. Peter's chest rose sharply, as though he had been struck. Without hesitation, he barked, "Remove those cuffs immediately!" The guards scrambled, fumbling with the keys, the shame visible in their hurried movements. Metal fell away from Ethan's wrists, leaving red welts behind, but he ignored the sting. The general straightened, turned toward the gathered soldiers and civilians, and raised his voice for all to hear. "This man is no intruder. This man is the shepherd. Every soldier who fought in the jungles of Vietnam knows that name. Every life saved in Operation Iron Vines owes a debt to him." Silence slammed over the cemetery, broken only by the low thrum of flags rustling in the wind. The senior officer who had ordered Ethan's removal looked stricken, his complexion drained of color. General Peters stepped back and saluted Ethan with crisp precision. For a heartbeat, nothing else moved. Then, like a wave breaking, hundreds of soldiers rose to their feet and returned the salute. The sound of boots striking ground in unison filled the air, an echo of discipline and recognition that erased mockery in an instant. Veterans in the crowd stood, some with tears streaking their lined faces, their hands trembling yet firm as they raised them in respect. Ethan stood still, his frail body dwarfed by the sudden swell of reverence, but his eyes burned with life. The decades of silence, the years of being overlooked, all crumbled beneath the tidal wave of acknowledgement. Wallace's casket reached its place of honor at the front, and Peter's voice rang out again, steady, commanding. This man carried General Wallace through hellfire. Without him, there would be no ceremony today. Without him, there would be no Wallace to honor. The crowd gasped, some hands covering mouths in disbelief. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras shifted toward Ethan, lenses capturing his still frame against the backdrop of flags and marble. Hayes felt his heart thunder in his chest. Everything the old man had said was true. He had not been delusional. He had been waiting for time to speak for him. The senior officer, humiliated, tried to recover. "General, I had no idea." Peters silenced him with a glare so sharp it cut the air. "You did not ask. You presumed. And in presuming, you nearly dishonored the man who carried our brother." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he turned back to Ethan, his eyes glistening. "Forgive us." Ethan shook his head gently. "No need. Time has its way." His voice was soft, but the cemetery carried it like thunder. Every ear caught the words, and they pressed into hearts like a brand. Then, with deliberate motion, General Peters gestured toward the front row of seats, the place reserved for family and the closest of comrades. "You sit where you belong," he said.
Ethan's legs trembled as he stepped forward, the crowd parting before him as though he were a tide no one dared resist. Each step seemed heavier than the last, not because of weakness, but because of the weight of memory flooding back. He reached the seat nearest to Wallace's family, and Wallace's daughter, her eyes red from grief, reached out to clasp his hand. "Thank you for bringing him home," she whispered. Ethan's throat tightened. He could not answer, but he nodded, lowering himself into the chair as the Rolex glinted once more in the morning sun. The tick of its second hand seemed louder than ever, a reminder that discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty had outlasted time itself. Around him, the crowd remained silent, as though afraid to shatter the fragile moment. Then, as if guided by something larger than ceremony, the soldiers who had carried Wallace's casket stepped back in unison and saluted again, this time not to the general, but to the old man in the worn suit. The message was unmistakable. History had been corrected, respect had been restored. And in that moment, Ethan Brooks, once mocked and nearly erased, stood revealed as what he had always been. The cemetery trembled with the weight of revelation, and the world that had doubted him now stood at attention. The humiliation of the morning dissolved, replaced by awe, and for the first time in decades, Ethan felt the promise fulfilled. Time had proved who he was. The applause that had not been part of the script slowly died into silence, replaced by the faint rustle of flags in the morning air. Ethan sat in the front row, his hands folded in his lap, the Rolex gleaming faintly as though even the watch had been waiting for this moment. Around him, the air seemed different, heavy with reverence. Yet, in the shadows of the ceremony, not everyone carried pride. The senior officer who had ordered his restraint stood stiff at attention, his face pale, sweat glistening near his temple. He avoided the general's eyes, but his guilt was as visible as the polished brass on his collar. As the funeral rites continued, reporters scribbled furiously, the narrative already shifting in their notebooks. What had begun as an uneventful state ceremony was now transformed into a story of redemption and revelation. By the time the final volley of rifle fire echoed across Arlington, the whispers had grown into a storm. Words passed through the crowd like sparks. Shepherd, savior, the man who carried Wallace. No one spoke of an intruder anymore. Everyone spoke of the forgotten hero whose silence had been broken by time itself. When the final notes of taps faded, General Peters turned not toward the family but toward the officer who had humiliated Ethan. His voice was low, but every soldier nearby felt the blade in it. "Lieutenant Colonel Myers, you will report to my office after this ceremony. Effective immediately, you are relieved of command for the day." The words hit like thunder. Myers stiffened, his mouth opening to protest, but the general's eyes silenced him before sound escaped. Soldiers near him shifted uncomfortably, the shame spreading through the ranks like an infection. Justice, Ethan thought, did not need vengeance. It needed truth, and the truth was unfolding. He could see it in the way Wallace's daughter held his hand tightly, in the way young Hayes stood taller now, proud that he had doubted the narrative others forced upon him. Yet Ethan also saw the faces of those who had mocked him only an hour earlier. Some looked away, ashamed. Others wore expressions of defiance, unwilling to admit their own cruelty. That was the nature of human hearts. Some cracked open under truth, others hardened like stone. The ceremony concluded, but the real battle had just begun. Within hours, headlines swept across news outlets. Forgotten hero discovered at general's funeral. Shepherd revealed as savior of Wallace in Vietnam. The photos told their own story. An old man in a frayed suit, Rolex glinting in the sun, saluted by generals and privates alike. The public devoured the tale, hungry for an image of humility triumphing over arrogance. Yet, alongside the praise came scrutiny. Reporters dug into Myers's record, unearthing complaints of arrogance and harsh treatment of subordinates. Old wounds reopened, whispered stories of his disdain for veterans who had fallen into poverty. Soon, petitions circulated, demanding his resignation.
Commentators on television condemned his behavior, pointing to the irony of dishonoring the very values the military claimed to uphold. Justice was not just descending, it was sweeping like a storm. Ethan watched from a quiet hospital room later that evening, where Wallace's family had insisted he rest. The television flickered with his own image, grainy clips replayed endlessly. It felt surreal, as though someone else's life had been stitched over his own. Nurses paused in the doorway to stare. Young soldiers visited with flowers, their faces earnest, their salutes crisp. One whispered, "Sir, you've given us a new standard for discipline and loyalty." Ethan smiled faintly. He had not come seeking recognition, yet it found him nonetheless. But while the world praised, Myers sat in a private office across town, his face buried in his hands. He had built a career on authority, never doubting his own judgment. Now, the same public he once dismissed turned against him. He replayed the moment of placing the cuffs on Ethan, the tremor in the old man's voice when he invoked Wallace, the Rolex glinting like a witness. Myers told himself he had followed protocol, but deep down he knew it had not been protocol. It had been pride, and pride had collapsed in front of the nation. The Army announced a formal review. Justice, once quiet, now roared across press conferences and official memos. Myers' allies abandoned him, fearful of the backlash. Even his friends turned silent, unwilling to defend what could not be excused. In interviews, veterans demanded accountability. "You don't put chains on a man who carried one of ours out of the jungle," one said on national television. Another added, "Discipline is not humiliation, it's respect for sacrifice." Through it all, Ethan remained calm. He did not call for punishment, nor did he revel in Myers' disgrace. Instead, he reminded those around him of what Wallace had always said: respect is not on the chest, it's in the heart. He repeated it gently to reporters, to soldiers, even to Wallace's daughter. His voice carried not bitterness, but wisdom, and that only deepened the impact of his story. The revelation of his identity sent ripples into places he had never imagined. Congress mentioned his name in speeches about veterans' care. Charitable organizations reached out, offering assistance for his remaining years. Former soldiers wrote letters to the editor, sharing their own memories of the shepherd, the quiet man who had guided them through chaos when all hope seemed lost. And Ethan, weary though he was, accepted it with humility, never letting praise swell into arrogance. Yet one night, alone, he thought of Myers. He wondered what demons drove the man to such haste, what insecurities made him equate authority with cruelty. Ethan knew that war left scars invisible to medals. Perhaps Myers, too, carried wounds unseen, bitterness that festered until it lashed out at others. Justice was necessary, but understanding was not its enemy. Ethan closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer for the man who had nearly erased him, hoping that even in disgrace, he might find humility and growth. Meanwhile, the nation continued to dissect the story. For every person who applauded Ethan's discipline, another debated how many shepherds had been lost to silence, how many forgotten veterans had died without acknowledgement. Newspapers published editorials calling for reform, insisting that no soldier who served should ever be left to stand outside a gate, mocked and dismissed. The weight of one man's humiliation had triggered a reckoning far beyond Arlington. Wallace's daughter, still grieving, told reporters that her father had often spoken of a mysterious friend who never sought the spotlight. "He said a watch kept him alive," she explained. "Now I know what he meant." Her words carried across the country, transforming the Rolex into a symbol. People posted photos of their own watches online, captioned with words about patience, loyalty, and time proving the truth. A movement blossomed, fueled not by slogans, but by quiet respect. As days turned into weeks, Myers faced formal dismissal. He stood before a board of inquiry, stripped of his command, his voice breaking as he tried to defend himself. Cameras captured his fall, and though some sneered, Ethan felt only pity. Pride had made Myers blind, but exposure might yet teach him the lesson Ethan had carried since the jungle. Humility is stronger than rank. The justice that unfolded was not revenge, it was revelation. It showed the world the cost of arrogance and the enduring power of quiet discipline. It restored dignity to one who had been cast aside, and it offered warning to those who mistook authority for infallibility. Ethan bore it all with calm, knowing that his task was not to gloat, but to guide. He continued to sit quietly at Wallace's grave, day after day, the Rolex ticking steadily at his wrist. Visitors came, saluted, left flowers, shared stories. Some asked for his advice, others simply wanted to sit near him in silence. He gave them both, never raising his voice, never drawing attention. His justice was not in the punishment of others, but in the restoration of truth. Time had indeed proved who he was, and now time was proving who others were as well. Some stood taller in revelation, others fell under its weight. But for Ethan Brooks, justice had never been about triumph over enemies. It was about carrying the burden of truth with dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. And as the sun dipped low over Arlington, casting long shadows across rows of marble, the old man sat unmoving, the Rolex gleaming softly, a beacon of discipline, humility, and the quiet justice that time always brings. The weeks that followed turned Arlington into more than a cemetery. It became a pilgrimage site not just for those who had served, but for anyone who had ever wondered whether sacrifice could be forgotten. Ethan Brooks found himself at the center of a storm he never sought, his name whispered in classrooms, churches, and living rooms across the country. His face, lined with age and humility, appeared on front pages. The Rolex on his wrist became an icon, its cracked glass shimmering like proof that endurance outlasts arrogance. Yet despite the sudden recognition, Ethan lived as he always had, quietly, without demand, never asking for reward. Change, however, had already begun to ripple outward. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced new initiatives for elder veterans, programs designed to ensure no one who had served would be left to die in silence or poverty. Young officers received training modules titled The Shepherd Principle, emphasizing leadership through humility, listening before judging, respect before authority. Ethan did not draft these reforms, but his story carried them forward like wind beneath wings. Politicians invoked his name when they spoke of discipline and sacrifice. Communities gathered at war memorials, holding up watches in silence, honoring not just him, but the countless men and women whose service had never been recorded in textbooks. Ethan himself resisted interviews, though occasionally he agreed when the request came from students or cadets. He preferred small rooms, honest questions, not the glare of television lights. When asked what his secret was, he smiled faintly. Discipline is not for others to see, it is for yourself when no one is watching. Respect is not earned by demanding it, but by giving it first. His words spread across social media, quoted in classrooms and stitched onto banners. Teenagers who had never known war repeated them as mantras for exams, for athletics, for the storms of adolescence. His voice, gravelly and measured, became a guide far beyond the military. One afternoon, he returned to Crownsville High School, where cadets in crisp uniforms lined the gymnasium. They had studied Wallace as a general, but now they listened to the man who had carried him when he was still a terrified private. Ethan told them not of glory, but of mud, of rain, of nights when fear made hands tremble, but discipline made them steady. He reminded them that leadership is proven not in command, but in sacrifice. When he finished, the gym fell into silence, then erupted into applause, so thunderous it made him flinch. For a moment he closed his eyes and felt the weight of time ease. Wallace's voice seemed to echo in the rafters, telling him the promise had been kept. Meanwhile, Wallace's daughter invited Ethan into her family as though he had always belonged. At dinners, grandchildren climbed onto his lap, asking him about jungles and helicopters, eyes wide with fascination. He laughed softly, answering not with tales of violence, but with lessons of endurance. He told them about fireflies that glowed even in the darkest nights, about men who sang songs of home under tarps of rain. He made them see war not as spectacle, but as proof of resilience. And in return, the children offered him what time had stolen: family. The army, still burdened by the disgrace of Myers, sought to restore its image by honoring Ethan formally. A ceremony was arranged at the Pentagon. Generals in starched uniforms stood at attention as Ethan was presented with a distinguished service medal he had never received. The nation watched live as the medal was placed on his chest, but Ethan's eyes remained on the watch at his wrist. Later, when reporters asked how he felt, he answered, "This medal will tarnish, time will not." His humility only deepened the nation's admiration. Justice for Myers concluded with his dismissal, but even in disgrace, he sought Ethan's presence. One evening, as the sun lowered over Arlington, Myers approached cautiously. His uniform was gone, replaced by civilian clothes that seemed too heavy for his posture. He removed his cap, standing awkwardly before the old man. "I wronged you," he said simply. "I let pride blind me." Ethan studied him, saw the weariness in his eyes, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let time teach you. Humility is not weakness. It is strength in silence." Myers nodded, tears glistening, and walked away lighter than he had arrived. It was not forgiveness in words, but in presence, and it marked the beginning of his redemption. As months turned into a year, Ethan's story became legend. Documentaries were made, plays were written, and songs composed about the shepherd who proved time stronger than humiliation. Yet Ethan never allowed himself to believe he was extraordinary. When asked what he thought of the attention, he shook his head gently. "I am one man. There are thousands you never heard of who did the same. Remember them, not me." Still, he could not stop what had begun. A scholarship fund named The Shepherd's Legacy was created, supporting children of veterans in pursuing education. Ethan attended its first award ceremony, his eyes moist as young scholars thanked him for inspiring them to work hard, to discipline themselves, to chase dreams. In his final years, Ethan spent most mornings at Wallace's grave. He carried no speeches, no demands. He sat with folded hands, the Rolex ticking softly as visitors approached to shake his hand or leave flowers. Some brought watches of their own, placing them on the headstone for a moment before slipping them back on, a silent pledge to carry time with dignity. Others simply sat beside him in silence, drawing strength. Now promoted, walked beside him and offered his arm. Ethan accepted with a faint smile. "Discipline, Lieutenant," he murmured. "It carries you further than strength." Hayes nodded, helping him to his usual bench. The younger officer knew he was witnessing the slow close of a chapter in history, yet he also knew the story would never end. Too many had already carried it forward. When Ethan passed quietly in his sleep months later, the nation mourned, not with pomp, but with silence. Across the country, people stopped at noon, holding up watches, listening to the tick that reminded them of discipline, humility, and time's quiet judgment. His funeral at Arlington overflowed not only with generals and soldiers, but with teachers, farmers, students, and children. General Peters delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he said, "He was our shepherd. He carried us when we could not walk, and he carried the truth when no one wanted to hear it." The final image was simple. As the casket lowered, Wallace's daughter placed Ethan's Rolex atop the flag, letting the sun catch its scratched glass one last time. The tick echoed in the silence, then faded. Yet in that stillness, every heart knew the sound would continue forever. Not in gears, but in memory, a symbol that time had proved him right. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. More underdog stories are coming your way.